You already know what it feels like when someone seems to operate on a completely different cognitive wavelength than you do. That moment when you explain something you consider obvious, and the other person stares at you with genuine confusion. Or worse, when you find yourself unable to grasp a concept that everyone else around you seems to understand effortlessly. Your chest tightens slightly, your palms might get a bit clammy, and that familiar voice in your head whispers that maybe you are not as intelligent as you thought, or maybe everyone else is simply wired differently. You have experienced this disconnect countless times, whether in professional meetings where colleagues jump to conclusions you cannot follow, in personal relationships where your partner thinks in patterns that feel alien to you, or even in solitary moments when you struggle with problems that should theoretically be solvable, but somehow remain just beyond your mental reach. The frustration builds slowly, like pressure behind your eyes, because you cannot quite identify what makes the difference between minds that seem to navigate complexity with ease and minds that constantly stumble over invisible obstacles. This cognitive gap affects far more than your intellectual confidence. It shapes your career trajectory when promotions go to people who demonstrate thinking patterns your superiors recognize and value, while your different approach gets labeled as lacking strategic vision or being too concrete. It damages your relationships when partners accuse you of being rigid or unable to see their perspective, when in reality you are operating from a fundamentally different cognitive framework that neither of you understands. It creates a persistent sense of being slightly out of sync with the world, like everyone else received an instruction manual for effective thinking that somehow never reached you. You compensate by working harder, reading more, trying to force your brain into patterns that feel unnatural, which only leads to exhaustion without producing the cognitive transformation you desperately seek. The worst part is not knowing whether this limitation is permanent, whether your mind simply topped out at some developmental ceiling while others continued evolving, or whether something in your cognitive architecture can still shift if you only knew what needed changing. What Jean Piaget discovered in his decades of meticulous observation was not primarily about children, though that is where he conducted his research. His most revolutionary finding was that human thinking does not exist on a simple continuum from less intelligent to more intelligent, but rather operates through qualitatively distinct modes that transform the very nature of what your mind can process. These are not minor upgrades or incremental improvements, but fundamental restructurings of cognitive architecture. And here is what almost no one tells you. Most adults never complete all the transformations their minds are capable of achieving. You have likely been operating for years or decades in a cognitive mode that feels complete and final, but is actually just one stage in a sequence of possible evolutions. The 8 specific patterns that distinguish evolved minds from those stuck in earlier developmental stages are not mysterious or inaccessible. They are identifiable, observable, and most importantly, they reveal exactly where your own thinking might still be operating in modes you outgrew everywhere else in your life, except in these specific domains. Today I'm going to show you precisely what these 8 cognitive patterns look like, how Piaget discovered them, through observations so detailed they changed our understanding of human intelligence, and most critically, which of these patterns you might be missing without even realizing it. Because once you recognize the difference between thinking modes, the confusion that has plagued you for years suddenly makes perfect sense. In the spring of 1921, Piaget was working in Paris at the laboratory school directed by Alfred Binet, the psychologist who had developed the first intelligence tests. Piaget's job was to standardize Cyril Bert's reasoning tests on Parisian children, which meant administering the same questions to many children and recording which ones they answered correctly at different ages. The work was supposed to be mechanical and straightforward, the kind of research task that generates data for statistical analysis without requiring much interpretation. But Piaget became fascinated not by the correct answers, which were predictable and fit neat age-based patterns, but by the specific types of errors children made consistently at particular ages. A question that seems to have particularly caught his attention involved showing children 3 boxes of different colors and asking them to identify which box contained a hidden object based on verbal clues. Children below a certain age could not solve this problem no matter how many times Piaget explained the logic. Yet a few months later, those same children would find it almost trivially easy. What changed was not their memory, their vocabulary, or their motivation, but something more fundamental about how they could hold relationships between ideas in their mind simultaneously. Piaget began conducting informal interviews with children, asking them to explain their reasoning process rather than just recording their final answers. What he discovered was that children were not simply making random mistakes or failing to pay attention. They were using perfectly logical reasoning based on a cognitive structure that operated by different rules than adult thinking. One child, when asked why clouds move across the sky, explained with complete confidence that the clouds were following him, moving when he moved and stopping when he stopped. When Piaget asked how the clouds knew to follow him, the child explained that they watched him and wanted to stay with him. This was not ignorance or fantasy in the way we usually understand those terms. The child had observed that clouds appeared to move in the same direction he walked, which was accurate observation. He had developed a logical explanation for this correlation, which was logical reasoning. What he lacked was a specific cognitive capacity, the ability to separate his own perspective and actions from objective physical causation, to understand that correlation does not imply intentional relationship. Piaget termed this cognitive limitation egocentrism, not in the moral sense of selfishness, but in the literal sense that the child could only process reality from the center of his own experience, unable to construct a model of the world that operated independently of his presence in it. This observation became the foundation for understanding the first crucial pattern that separates evolved thinking from earlier modes. Evolved minds possess what Piaget called decentration, the capacity to mentally step outside their own immediate perspective and construct models of reality that exist independently of their personal experience. When you encounter someone who genuinely cannot understand why their behavior affected you the way it did, because they did not intend that effect, you are observing thinking that has not fully developed this capacity. The person is not being malicious or deliberately obtuse. They are operating in a cognitive mode where intention and effect are not yet fully separated, where if they meant well, the actual impact should align with that intention because their subjective experience is still the primary lens through which they interpret causation. You see this constantly in workplace conflicts where someone defends their action by explaining their good intentions, genuinely confused about why you keep focusing on the negative outcome as if those are two separate things that need separate accounting. The cognitive evolution that shifts thinking from egocentric to decentered does not happen through moral instruction or being told to consider other perspectives. It happens through a specific type of cognitive conflict that forces the mind to recognize its current model cannot explain certain recurring discrepancies between predicted and actual results. Piaget continued his observations when he returned to Switzerland and began working at the Institut Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Geneva. He married one of his students, Valentine Châtenay, and when they had children, Piaget began keeping detailed daily observations of their cognitive development from infancy. These observations, published in 3 books between 1926 and 1945, documented thousands of small interactions that revealed the hidden cognitive transformations occurring in the first 2 years of life. One observation that proved particularly significant involved his daughter Jacqueline at around 8 months old. Piaget would show her an attractive toy, let her reach for it, then hide it under a blanket while she watched. Despite having seen exactly where the object went, despite the blanket showing an obvious bump where the toy was hidden, Jacqueline would not reach for it. She would look at the spot where the toy had been visible, appear confused, then lose interest and turn to something else. A few weeks later, Piaget repeated the exact same action, and Jacqueline immediately reached under the blanket and retrieved the toy, showing delight at her success. What had changed in those few weeks was the development of what Piaget called object permanence, the understanding that objects continue to exist even when you cannot perceive them. Before this cognitive structure develops, out of sight is literally out of existence. The toy under the blanket has not been hidden, it has ceased to be, which is why searching for it makes no logical sense from the infant's cognitive perspective. This seems like a simple development, perhaps even obvious, until you recognize that this same cognitive pattern operates at much more abstract levels throughout life. When someone tells you they will do something, then completely forgets about it the moment the conversation ends, they may not be irresponsible in the way you think. They may be operating with a version of object permanence that is not fully extended to abstract commitments. The promise existed vividly during the conversation when it was perceptually present, but once the interaction ended and attention shifted elsewhere, the commitment ceased to have mental existence until the specific context returned. This is not about memory capacity or character flaws. It is about whether cognitive structures have developed that maintain the existence of abstract objects and relationships, independent of immediate perceptual presence. The second pattern that distinguishes evolved minds is this capacity for abstract object permanence, the ability to maintain the existence of ideas, commitments, principles, and relationships even when they are not perceptually present in immediate experience. People lacking this development are not necessarily unreliable in all domains. They may be perfectly consistent in areas where external structures provide constant reminders and immediate consequences. But in domains requiring self-generated maintenance of abstract continuity, their thinking simply does not sustain the object across gaps in attention. You have encountered this if you have ever worked with someone who is fully committed to a project during meetings, engaged and enthusiastic and full of ideas, but then produces nothing between meetings as if the project ceased to exist during the interval. The frustration you feel comes from assuming the person shares your cognitive structure, where the project maintains continuous existence in your mental model, accumulating attention and progress even when you are focused on other tasks. Their cognitive structure operates differently, and no amount of reminding or expressing disappointment will change it, because the development required is structural, not motivational. Piaget's observations expanded as his children grew, and one series of experiments he conducted with all three of his children revealed what became perhaps his most famous finding about cognitive development. He would show a child two identical glasses filled to the same level with liquid, and the child would readily agree they contained the same amount. Then, while the child watched, Piaget would pour one glass into a tall, thin container and the other into a short, wide container. The amounts remained exactly the same. The child had watched the entire pouring process. There was no trick or sleight of hand involved. When Piaget asked whether the containers now had the same amount or different amounts, children below a certain age would consistently say they were different. The tall, thin container had more because the liquid reached higher. When Piaget pointed out that nothing had been added or removed, the child would agree but still insist the amounts were different because the heights were different. When he offered to pour them back to prove they were the same, then poured them again into different shaped containers, the child would again claim they were different amounts. This was not perceptual illusion or a mistake the child could be argued out of. It reflected a genuine cognitive limitation in the mental operations available to the child. What these children lacked was what Piaget called conservation, the understanding that certain properties remain constant despite changes in appearance. The child could see the height, could see the width, but could not perform the mental operation of compensating one dimension against the other. Their thinking could track one dimension at a time but could not coordinate multiple dimensions simultaneously, to recognize that what was gained in height was lost in width. Around age 6 or 7 for most children, something shifts in their cognitive structure, and suddenly conservation becomes obvious. They do not need to measure or calculate. They immediately recognize that the amount must be the same because nothing was added or removed, and they often look at the adult asking the question as if it is a silly question with an obvious answer. The cognitive operation that makes this possible is what Piaget called reversibility, the ability to mentally reverse an action and recognize that certain transformations can be undone to return to the starting state. The third pattern of evolved thinking is operational reversibility, applied to abstract domains. This is not the same as simply understanding that actions have consequences, or that you can sometimes undo what you did. It is the specific capacity to maintain the identity of something through transformations by mentally coordinating multiple dimensions of change simultaneously. You see the absence of this cognitive structure when someone makes a decision that transforms their life situation, then cannot understand why they feel disconnected from who they used to be. They changed their career, or ended a relationship, or moved to a new city, and now they feel lost as if their identity was destroyed rather than transformed. They cannot perform the mental operation of recognizing which core elements remained constant through the transformation and which elements changed. So instead of experiencing continuity of self through change, they experience fragmentation. Someone with fully developed operational thinking can hold both the changed and unchanged dimensions simultaneously, recognizing how the same person exists through the transformation while acknowledging real changes occurred. This is why some people navigate major life transitions with their sense of identity intact, while others feel shattered by changes that, from outside, seem manageable. Let me tell you about a specific observation Piaget made that many people find deeply uncomfortable because it reveals cognitive limitations we prefer not to acknowledge in ourselves. He was working with children around age 5 or 6, conducting what seemed like simple classification tasks. He would show a child a set of wooden beads, most of them brown but a few of them white, and ask the child to confirm that all the beads were wooden. The child would readily agree, having examined the beads and confirmed they were all made of wood. Then Piaget would ask whether there were more brown beads or more wooden beads. Despite having just confirmed that all the beads were wooden, children at this stage would consistently answer that there were more brown beads. When Piaget asked them to explain, they would say there were only a few white beads, so obviously there were more brown ones. When Piaget pointed out that both the brown beads and white beads were wooden, so the wooden beads should include all of them, the child would agree but still maintain there were more brown beads than wooden beads. This seems absurd from an adult perspective, an obvious logical error that should be correctable through simple explanation. But what the child lacks is not information or attention. They lack a specific cognitive structure that Piaget called class inclusion, the ability to hold a category and its subcategories in mind simultaneously, and understand the logical relationship between them. The child can think about brown beads as a category, can think about wooden beads as a category, but cannot perform the mental operation of maintaining the superordinate category while simultaneously considering the subordinate category as a subset within it. When they focus on brown beads, the category of wooden beads temporarily loses its inclusive meaning. When they focus on wooden beads, the distinction between brown and white temporarily dissolves. They cannot hold both levels of the hierarchy active in working memory simultaneously, so they oscillate between them. And in that oscillation, the logical relationship that seems obvious to adult thinking becomes impossible to grasp. Here is what makes this deeply relevant to adult cognition. The same structural limitation operates at higher levels of abstraction in domains where our thinking has not fully developed class inclusion. You encounter this constantly in political and ideological discussions, where someone cannot simultaneously hold that a person can be a member of a general category and a specific subcategory with different attributes. They argue, for instance, that you cannot criticize a specific implementation of an idea without opposing the general idea itself, or conversely, that supporting the general idea means you must support every specific implementation. This is not stupidity or bad faith, though it often gets interpreted that way. It is the same cognitive structure Piaget observed with wooden beads, operating at a more abstract level. The person's thinking oscillates between the general category and the specific instance, but cannot maintain both simultaneously in a relationship of hierarchical inclusion. When you present examples that differentiate the levels, they agree in the moment, but then revert to conflating them because the cognitive operation that maintains the distinction is not yet stable in that domain of their thinking. The fourth cognitive pattern that marks evolved thinking is stable hierarchical classification, the capacity to maintain multiple levels of categorical organization simultaneously and recognize the logical relationships between superordinate and subordinate categories. Without this structure, thinking tends to be either overly concrete, unable to generalize across instances, or overly abstract, unable to recognize meaningful distinctions within categories. The person who says all politicians are corrupt is not wrong about the possibility of corruption in politics, but their thinking lacks the hierarchical structure to maintain simultaneously that corruption is a genuine systemic risk, and that individual politicians within the system vary significantly in their relationship to that corruption. Both observations can be true at once, but only if cognitive structures allow maintaining multiple levels of analysis in a coordinated relationship. Think about what happens when you are trying to explain a complex situation to someone, and they keep interrupting with objections that address specific details while missing the overall pattern you are describing. You explain that you are talking about a general principle, and they agree, but then immediately return to objecting based on specific exceptions. Or conversely, you are trying to discuss a specific situation, and they keep responding with general principles that do not quite fit the specific case. The frustration you both feel comes from a mismatch in cognitive operations. One person is maintaining hierarchical structure, moving fluidly between general and specific while keeping both in coordinated relationship. The other person is shifting between levels, but not maintaining the relationship. So each level contradicts the other, rather than existing in a nested relationship. Neither person is being deliberately difficult. They are operating with different cognitive structures that make different types of thinking possible or impossible. Piaget conducted another series of observations that revealed a cognitive shift with enormous implications for how people handle uncertainty and probability. He would present children with situations involving chance outcomes, like drawing colored balls from a bag or predicting which of several paths a ball rolling down an incline would take. Children at earlier developmental stages made predictions with complete confidence, explaining with elaborate detail exactly which outcome would occur. When their prediction proved wrong, they would construct explanations for why that particular outcome happened, often incorporating elements of intention or hidden causation. They were not distressed by being wrong, because each outcome, once it occurred, became fully explainable in retrospect. What they could not do was hold multiple possible outcomes in mind simultaneously as genuinely possible before the event occurred. They could imagine alternatives if asked, could list different possibilities, but in the actual moment of prediction, they collapsed the uncertainty into a definite expectation. Only one outcome felt real until it happened, at which point whichever outcome occurred became the one that had to happen for reasons they could then explain. The cognitive development that shifts this pattern involves what Piaget called operational thought applied to possibilities. This is not the same as understanding that you might be wrong or that multiple outcomes are theoretically possible. It is the capacity to maintain multiple potential outcomes as simultaneously real in your mental model, to think with genuine uncertainty rather than certainty that you later discover was misplaced. People lacking this cognitive structure can acknowledge intellectually that they do not know what will happen, but their actual thinking process treats one outcome as real and others as abstract alternatives. You encounter this when someone makes elaborate plans based on an assumption. You point out that the assumption might not hold. They agree it might not, but continue planning as if it definitely will, then express shock and betrayal when reality does not match their expectation. They did not ignore your warning. They could not cognitively operate in the mode where multiple futures exist simultaneously with different probabilities. Their thinking required collapsing uncertainty into a working assumption that then became psychologically real. The fifth pattern distinguishing evolved minds is genuine probabilistic thinking, the capacity to maintain multiple potential states or outcomes as simultaneously active in your mental model, with different weights or probabilities, without collapsing into false certainty. This cognitive structure transforms how you make decisions under uncertainty, how you evaluate risks, how you respond to outcomes different from your expectations. Someone operating with this structure does not feel betrayed when a low probability event occurs because low probability was never zero probability in their thinking. They do not feel vindicated when their prediction succeeds because the prediction was never certainty, just higher probability. Their emotional relationship to outcomes reflects the uncertainty that was genuinely present in their thinking throughout the process. You can hear the difference in how people talk about decisions retrospectively. Some people say they made the right decision because it worked out well, collapsing backward from outcome to decision quality. Others can say they made a good decision that happened to produce a poor outcome, because their evaluation maintains the uncertainty that was genuinely present at the decision point. The latter is operating with probabilistic cognitive structures. The former is not. Now think about what happens in conversations about systemic issues like poverty, education outcomes, or health disparities. One perspective explains outcomes primarily through individual choices and effort. Another explains outcomes primarily through systemic constraints and opportunities. These perspectives are often treated as ideological commitments or moral stances, But watch carefully what happens when people argue across this divide. Often, neither side can actually hold both causal factors in mind simultaneously with appropriate weight. One person collapses the complexity into individual agency, acknowledging systemic factors exist but treating them as background noise that does not really determine outcomes. Another person collapses the complexity into systemic determination, acknowledging individual choices exist, but treating them as essentially determined by circumstances. When you present cases that clearly require both factors, each side accommodates the case by temporarily shifting their emphasis, but then reverts to their primary mode. What you are watching is not primarily ideology. You are watching the cognitive structure Piaget called multiplicative coordination, or the lack thereof. As Piaget studied older children and adolescents, he identified a cognitive transformation that separates what he called concrete operational thinking from formal operational thinking. Concrete operational thinkers can perform sophisticated logical operations on objects and situations they can directly perceive or concretely imagine. They can conserve quantity, perform hierarchical classification, conduct mental reversals, and coordinate multiple dimensions of a concrete problem. But they struggle with a specific type of abstraction. Piaget demonstrated this with what became known as the pendulum problem. He gave adolescents a pendulum and several variables they could manipulate: the weight of the pendulum bob, the length of the string, the force of the initial push, and the height from which it was released. Their task was to determine which factor or factors controlled the frequency of the pendulum's swing. Younger adolescents would approach this by varying multiple factors at once, then drawing conclusions from the outcome. They might use a heavy weight on a long string with a strong push, then try a light weight on a short string with a weak push, then conclude that weight matters because the second swing was faster. They were actively experimenting, genuinely trying to figure it out, but they could not systematically isolate variables. What they lacked was not intelligence or motivation, but a specific cognitive structure. The ability to think hypothetically about all possible combinations of variables, then systematically test each combination while holding others constant. This requires maintaining a mental model of an entire set of logical possibilities that have not yet been tested, operating on that abstract model to design a testing sequence, then mapping empirical results back onto the logical model. This is formal operational thinking, the capacity to reason about abstract possibilities independently of concrete content. Adolescents who had developed this structure would approach the pendulum problem by first identifying all the variables, then systematically testing each one while holding the others constant, generating a logical conclusion based on the pattern of results across the complete set of tests. The difference is not that one group is smarter. The difference is that one group has access to a cognitive operation that makes systematic hypothesis testing possible, while the other group is still bound to concrete trial and error, even when trying to be systematic. Here is what almost no one tells you about formal operational thinking. Piaget's later research and subsequent studies by other developmental psychologists found that many adults never fully develop formal operational structures across all domains of their thinking. You might operate with formal operations in your professional domain, capable of systematic hypothesis testing and abstract logical reasoning about complex systems within your expertise. But in other domains, your thinking reverts to concrete operations, unable to maintain the same level of abstraction and systematic analysis. This is why highly intelligent people can be sophisticated thinkers about their specialty, while reasoning like adolescents about politics, relationships, or any domain where their thinking has not undergone that particular cognitive development. The sixth pattern that marks evolved thinking is domain-general formal operations, the extension of hypothetical deductive reasoning beyond specialized areas into broader life domains. Someone with this development can take a complex situation with multiple interacting factors, construct a mental model of possible causal relationships, then systematically evaluate which factors actually drive outcomes by considering what would be different under alternative configurations. They can do this not just in domains where they have explicit training, but as a general cognitive approach to understanding any complex situation. You recognize the absence of this structure when someone who is brilliant in their field makes remarkably simplistic arguments about anything outside that field, treating complex multi-causal systems as if they operate through simple single-cause mechanisms. They are not being intellectually lazy. They are operating with cognitive structures that work differently across domains, formal operations in one area and concrete operations in others. Let me pause here and ask you to think about this honestly. Have you ever found yourself absolutely certain about how to solve a major social or political problem, only to encounter someone with actual expertise in that domain, who explains layers of complexity you had not considered? That moment of genuine confusion where you wonder how they can see such a simple solution as complicated is often the marker of cognitive structure difference. Your thinking approached the problem with concrete operations, identifying visible factors, and constructing direct causal links. Their thinking approached the same problem with formal operations, modeling multiple interacting variables and considering second-order effects that are not directly visible. Neither perspective is morally superior, but they are cognitively different, and the difference is not about information or intelligence. It is about the cognitive operations available to process whatever information you have. Now here is a detail about your own experience that you might not have fully recognized. Think about moments when you suddenly understood something that had confused you for a long time. Not because you learned new information, but because you could suddenly see the same information in a completely different way. That familiar sensation of pieces clicking into place, of wondering how you did not see it before when it now seems obvious. What you experienced in those moments was likely not learning, but developmental shift, a change in the cognitive structures available to process information you already had. Piaget argued that development happens through a process he called equilibration, where cognitive structures that work adequately in most situations eventually encounter problems they cannot assimilate, creating disequilibrium that motivates cognitive restructuring. The new structure accommodates the problematic case while maintaining the successes of the old structure, creating a more comprehensive and flexible cognitive organization. This process does not happen automatically with age or experience. It requires specific types of cognitive conflict that your current structures cannot resolve, combined with environmental support for constructing new structures. This is why some people's thinking continues evolving throughout their lives, while others get stuck in patterns they established decades earlier. The difference is not about being open-minded or curious, though those help. The difference is about whether you continue encountering situations that create genuine disequilibrium in your thinking, problems your current cognitive structures genuinely cannot assimilate, and whether you have the psychological safety and cognitive flexibility to reconstruct your thinking rather than dismissing the problems as exceptions or errors in perception. So here's what you do with this understanding. You start small, with one mental operation at a time. If centration is your strongest pattern, practice the simple exercise of naming 3 true things about any situation that triggers you, instead of collapsing into the one overwhelming feature. Your partner forgot the appointment, and they texted you something sweet this morning, and they've been stressed at work. Hold all 3 simultaneously, even when your mind wants to collapse into just the forgetting. If object permanence is your struggle, write down evidence of someone's care or your own competence and read it daily, not to convince yourself but to practice maintaining the internal representation when external confirmation isn't present. If egocentrism dominates, practice the uncomfortable work of describing a conflict from the other person's perspective without defending your own. Not to agree with them, but to build the mental muscle of holding 2 perspectives as real. If class inclusion trips you up, practice naming the category and the instance separately. This was a difficult conversation, and I'm someone learning to communicate better. This rejection hurts, and I'm a person with value. If concrete thinking limits you, practice hypothetical reasoning by asking yourself regularly, if I operated from the principle of self-compassion, what would I do right now? Not what feels natural, not what you've always done, but what would be consistent with that abstract principle, even if you've never done it before. These aren't affirmations or positive thinking. They're cognitive construction exercises that force your mind to perform operations it's been avoiding. They feel awkward and unnatural at first because you're building new neural pathways for processing reality. But here's what Piaget understood that changes everything. Your mind wants to grow. It's designed to resolve contradictions and construct new structures when old ones prove inadequate. You just have to give it the right conditions, the deliberate practice of operations beyond your current capacity, combined with patience for the disequilibrium that comes with growth. Listen, if you've made it this far in this video, you're not someone who settles for surface-level understanding. You're looking for something real, something that actually shifts how you experience your life, not just how you think about it. That's exactly why I create the content I do here, diving deep into the psychological structures that actually determine how we show up in the world. Every week I bring you insights from developmental psychology, neuroscience, and decades of research into human transformation. Not the quick fix version, but the truth about how minds actually change. If this resonates with you, if you want to continue this journey of building the cognitive structures you never got to develop, click that subscribe button. You're not just subscribing to a channel, you're joining a community of people committed to real growth, the kind that happens in the uncomfortable space between who you've been and who you're becoming. I'll be here every step of the way, and if you want to go deeper into Piaget's work, watch the next video where I break down exactly how the equilibration process works and the specific practices that accelerate cognitive development in adulthood. It's the natural next step in understanding not just what's been limiting you, but how to systematically move beyond those limits. I'll see you there.